There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a simple knock on a door, the familiar sound of rain against glass. They carry no banner, announce no grand entrance. They slip into the quiet rhythm of an evening, and, only in retrospect, do you understand that they were not moments at all, but hinges. They were the points upon which the entire architecture of your future was about to turn. For me, that hinge was the sound of Julian's fist against my apartment door, just after midnight on a Tuesday in October, with the sky weeping a cold, relentless torrent that seemed determined to wash the whole city clean. It was a sound that was both entirely expected and utterly world-shattering, because I knew, even before I saw him, that he was not there for any of the dozen reasons a friend might show up unannounced. He was there because he had run out of other places to be. I had been in my darkroom, a converted walk-in closet that always smelled of vinegar and silver, watching an image of a deserted pier slowly materialize in the developer tray. It was a process of patience, of waiting for something hidden to reveal itself in its own time, which was, I suppose, a fitting metaphor for my entire life up to that point. The knock was soft at first, easily mistaken for a quirk of the old building or a gust of wind rattling the frame. But then it came again, more insistent this time, a three-beat rhythm that was uniquely his. I felt the sound in my sternum, a low thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. I dried my hands on a towel, my heart beginning a slow, heavy climb up into my throat. The red safe light of the darkroom cast everything in a strange, submerged glow, and for a moment, I was a diver ascending too quickly, my lungs tight with a nameless pressure. I knew who it was. I always knew. When I opened the door, the sight of him stole the air from my lungs. He was drenched, utterly and completely saturated, as if he'd been standing under a waterfall instead of just walking from his car. Rainwater streamed from the ends of his dark hair, plastering it to his forehead and temples. It traced the strong lines of his jaw and dripped from the tip of his nose. His thin jacket was soaked through, clinging to his shoulders and chest, and his jeans were a darker shade of blue than they were supposed to be. But it wasn't the water that held me captive. It was his eyes. They were wide and lost, the color of a stormy sea, and they were fixed on me with a desperate, unspoken plea that bypassed every defense I had ever built around my heart. He looked like a ship that had been torn from its moorings, tossed by a violent tempest, and had finally, miraculously, washed up on the only shore it could find. My shore. He didn't say anything. He just stood there on my welcome mat, shivering, a puddle forming at his feet on the worn wooden floor of the hallway. The silence stretched between us, thick with the sound of the storm outside and the frantic, silent questions inside my own head. My mind raced, cataloging possibilities, excuses, reasons. A fight with his parents, a bad day at work, a forgotten key. But none of them fit the raw, unguarded vulnerability radiating from him. This was different. This was foundational. "You're getting soaked," I said, my voice sounding rough and unused. It was a stupid thing to say, a statement of the ridiculously obvious, but it was all I could manage. It was a rope thrown into the chasm of silence between us. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A drop of water fell from his eyelashes and tracked a path down his cheek like a tear. "Come in," I said, stepping back and opening the door wider. It felt like I was doing more than just letting him into my apartment. It felt like I was opening a door inside myself, a door I had kept carefully, painstakingly locked for years. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering from my face to the warm, dry space behind me, and in that flicker, I saw a universe of indecision and exhaustion. Then he moved, crossing the threshold in a few quick steps, bringing the scent of rain and cold night air into my small, quiet world. He stood dripping in the entryway, his arms wrapped around himself, looking small and broken in a way I had never seen him before. He still hadn't spoken a word. He didn't have to. His presence was a confession. It was a novel written in the language of shivering shoulders and haunted eyes, and I was, as always, its most devoted reader. Our friendship hadn't begun with a storm, but with the quiet, unassuming light of a Tuesday afternoon in a college photography class. I was there because it was my major, my entire world contained within f-stops and shutter speeds. Julian was there to fulfill a fine arts credit, a brief detour from his rigorous computer science curriculum. He was, even then, a study in contrasts. On the surface, he was all bright energy and easy confidence, the kind of person who collected friends effortlessly, who moved through crowded rooms with an unearned grace. He was surrounded by a constellation of people, a sun with his own gravitational pull. I, on the other hand, was a satellite in a distant orbit, content to observe from the quiet periphery, my camera a shield and a license to stare. I noticed him long before we ever spoke. I noticed the way his laugh was a beat too loud, as if to cover something quieter underneath. I noticed the way his eyes, when he thought no one was looking, would drift to the window, a flicker of restlessness in their depths. I had been hiding in the campus darkroom, a place of comforting solitude, when he'd knocked on the door, looking for the teaching assistant. He'd peered into the crimson gloom, his face a mask of polite confusion. I remember the exact moment our eyes met. It felt less like a meeting and more like a recognition, a faint click of something falling into place. I explained the developing process to him, my voice low in the reverent silence of the room. He listened with a genuine curiosity that surprised me. Most people found the technical aspects of film photography tedious, but he asked questions, smart ones, about the chemical reactions, about the way light could be captured and held like a memory in silver gelatin. We talked for an hour, surrounded by the ghosts of images hanging up to dry, and by the time he left, a thin, invisible thread had been spun between us. That thread strengthened over the next few years, woven from late-night study sessions in the library, cheap pizza consumed on the floor of my dorm room, and long, meandering conversations about everything and nothing. He would talk about code and algorithms, describing them with a strange, poetic passion that I found captivating. He saw beauty in the logic, in the elegant construction of a program that could solve a complex problem. I, in turn, would try to explain the world as I saw it through a lens, a world of light and shadow, of composition and decisive moments. He was the only person who never seemed bored when I spoke about it. He would look at my contact sheets for hours, pointing out a gesture or an expression I had captured, seeing the story within the frame. He saw me, I think, in a way most people didn't. He looked past the quiet exterior and saw the churning, observant world I kept hidden inside. Our friendship was an odd, comfortable fit. He was the anchor who drew me out of my shell, gently insisting I join him and his friends for a movie or a drink. I was the harbor he returned to when the noise of his own life became too much. He would show up at my door, just as he did on that rainy Tuesday years later, his social battery drained, and simply say, "Can I just sit here for a while?" We would exist in a comfortable silence, the only sound the soft click of my camera shutter or the tapping of his fingers on his laptop. He never seemed to need me to entertain him. He just needed me to be there. It was in those quiet moments that I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic fall. It was a slow, gentle erosion, like water wearing away stone. It was in the way he'd tilt his head when he was concentrating, a small furrow appearing between his brows. It was in the unself-conscious way he would steal a French fry from my plate. It was in the surprising depth of his empathy, a well he kept hidden beneath a surface of cheerful nonchalance. Of course, there was always Chloe. She had been a fixture in his life since his freshman year, a bright, bubbly girl who seemed, to the outside world, like his perfect match. They were the golden couple, their future a foregone conclusion. I liked Chloe truly. She was kind and funny, and she clearly adored Julian. I learned to compartmentalize my feelings, to build a sturdy wall around that part of my heart. My affection for Julian was a private, secret garden I tended to in solitude. I accepted it as a permanent, unchangeable feature of my own internal landscape, a beautiful, painful ache that I would carry with me always. The friendship was too precious to risk. The quiet safety we had built was a sanctuary, and I would have sooner cut off my own hand than do anything to jeopardize it. I became an expert in the art of loving from a distance, of translating a longing to hold his hand into a friendly pat on the shoulder, of turning the desire to tell him everything into a quiet, listening presence. I was the best friend. That was my role, and I played it to perfection. The shift began subtly, a change in the emotional weather that I felt long before I could name it. It started with the phone calls. Julian and Chloe had been fighting more frequently, Their arguments like distant thunder I could sometimes hear rumbling in the background when he called. He never went into detail, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the fraying edges of his patience. He was working long hours at a new consulting job that had him traveling constantly, living out of suitcases and sterile hotel rooms. He started talking more about being tired, not just physically, but in a deeper, more existential way. He spoke of a strange sense of dislocation, a feeling like he was playing a part in his own life. The easy confidence I had always associated with him began to show cracks, revealing the bedrock of anxiety and loneliness beneath. Then came the breakup. It wasn't a clean break, but a messy, protracted unraveling that took months. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, and I was the one he called after each new wound. He would call me from airport lounges and anonymous hotel rooms, his voice hollowed out by static and sadness. He wasn't looking for advice. He was looking for an anchor. He just needed to talk, to pour out the confusion and the hurt into a space where it would be held without judgment. I listened, my heart aching for him, the secret, selfish part of me whispering a dangerous, hopeful thought that I immediately silenced. His pain was not my opportunity. He was my friend, and he was hurting. That was all that mattered. When it was finally, officially over, a profound and unnerving silence fell over Julian's life. The future he had been building for the better part of a decade had crumbled into dust. The person who had filled the spaces in his days was gone. His apartment, the one he and Chloe had picked out together, became a museum of a life that no longer existed. He told me it felt haunted, that every object held a memory, every empty space echoed with her absence. He started spending more and more time at my place. My small, cluttered apartment, filled with books and camera equipment and the smell of coffee, became his refuge. It was neutral territory, a place with no ghosts. That was the catalyst. The breakup didn't create the space between us. It simply cleared away the debris that had been obscuring a path that was already there. He was adrift, and he instinctively, wordlessly, navigated his way to me. He hated being alone, he'd said one night, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the city lights outside my window. It was a simple statement, but it felt like a confession. It was the key that unlocked everything that came after. He wasn't just talking about his newly empty apartment. He was talking about a deeper, more pervasive loneliness, the kind that can exist even in a crowded room, the kind I had seen in his eyes all those years ago in our college classroom. He hated being alone. And so, he started showing up at my door, seeking not just company, but a specific kind of quiet, undemanding presence that, for whatever reason, he could only seem to find with me. And I, who had spent years perfecting the art of being his friend, let him in every single time. The ritual began a few weeks after that first rainy night. He had stayed late. We'd ordered takeout and watched some mindless action movie, the kind he loved and I tolerated. The credits rolled, and the familiar, heavy silence of a night winding down settled over the room. Usually, this was his cue to leave. He'd stretch, clap his hands on his knees, and say, "Well, I should probably head out." But this time, he didn't move. He just sat on my worn-out sofa, his legs stretched out, his head resting against the back cushion. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was slow and even. He looked utterly exhausted, as if the sheer weight of holding himself together all day had finally become too much to bear. "You can crash on the couch if you want," I'd offered, the words feeling both natural and momentous. No point in driving back tired. His eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, a flicker of something, gratitude, relief, something more complex, in his gaze. "Yeah," he'd asked, his voice soft. "You sure you don't mind?" "Of course not," I'd said, my own voice betraying none of the frantic activity in my chest. "Get some sleep." I got him a pillow and a thick quilt my grandmother had made, the one I kept for guests who never materialized. As I draped it over him, my fingers brushed against his shoulder. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through me, a sudden, sharp awareness of his physical presence in my space. He was asleep in my living room. He was a solid, breathing reality just a few feet away from where I would be sleeping. I went to my bedroom and closed the door, but it felt like a flimsy, useless barrier. I could feel his presence through the wall, a low, steady hum that recalibrated the entire atmosphere of my apartment. I lay awake for hours that night. listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in my home, my mind a whirlwind of hope and fear. That first night became the blueprint. A few days later, he stayed again. Then again the following week. Soon, it was a regular occurrence, an unspoken arrangement. He would show up after work, his tie loosened, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. We would fall into our easy rhythm of quiet companionship. He would work on his laptop while I edited photos. We would talk, or not talk. And then, at the end of the night, he would simply migrate to the couch. It became his spot. The dent in the cushion started to fit the shape of his body. He left a toothbrush in my bathroom, a spare charger by the outlet near the sofa. He was slowly, quietly, seeping into the cracks of my life, and I was doing nothing to stop him. Each night was a masterclass in self-torture for me. I was hyper-aware of everything. The way the quilt would slip off his shoulder as he slept, and the internal debate I'd have about whether to fix it, risking waking him. The soft, mumbled words he'd sometimes say in his sleep. The way the morning light would hit his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable. I would get up early to make coffee, moving as quietly as possible, just to have a few moments to watch him sleep, to study the peaceful expression on his face that was so absent when he was awake. It was a dangerous, addictive habit. I was the lone scientist in a laboratory of my own making, observing a beautiful, unpredictable phenomenon, meticulously recording every detail, terrified of contaminating the experiment with my own desires. The plausible deniability of it all was the true genius of our strange new arrangement. He was my friend. He was going through a hard time. He was lonely. I was helping him. Any one of these statements, taken individually, was true. Strung together, they formed a neat, tidy narrative that we could both present to the world, and, more importantly, to ourselves. It was a story that protected us. It allowed him to seek the physical and emotional comfort he so clearly craved without having to name it, and it allowed me to have him close without having to face the terrifying possibility of rejection. We were existing in a carefully constructed bubble of ambiguity, a space where the rules of our old friendship had been suspended, but no new rules had yet been written. Then, one night in the dead of winter, the ritual escalated. A blizzard had descended on the city, piling snow in silent, heavy drifts. The wind howled, rattling my window panes. Julian had been at my place since the afternoon, the weather making a trip back to his own apartment treacherous. We were cocooned in my small, warm living room, the world outside reduced to a vortex of white. The heating in my old building was notoriously unreliable, and a distinct chill had begun to creep into the room. Julian was huddled on the couch, wrapped in the quilt, but he was still shivering. "It's freezing in here," he'd said, his teeth chattering slightly. "I know," I'd replied, turning up the small space heater I kept for emergencies. "Old building. The insulation is a joke." We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the whistle of the wind and the hum of the heater. Then, he looked over at me from his nest of blankets. His expression was hesitant, his eyes searching mine. "This is going to sound weird," he began, his voice low. "But my apartment is always freezing. Chloe used to call me a human furnace. I can't get warm when I'm alone." He paused, and the unspoken part of his sentence hung in the air between us. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what was coming. I could see the shape of the question before he even formed the words. It was a terrifying, beautiful, impossible shape. "My bedroom is warmer," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside me. "The radiator in there actually works. It was an offering." A door left ajar. He watched me for a long moment, his gaze intense. "Leo," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Would it be okay if I just slept on your floor? Just for tonight. It's warmer in there." The floor. He was asking to sleep on my floor. It was another masterful stroke of plausible deniability. It wasn't about sharing a bed. It was about thermodynamics. It was about seeking warmth. It was a request so practical, so logical, that to refuse it would have seemed cruel. "My floor is hardwood, Julian," I said, trying for a note of gentle practicality. "You'll be miserable." "I don't care," he said quickly. "I'll take miserable over frozen." And so, I found myself in the surreal position of making a pallet of blankets and spare pillows on the floor beside my bed. He settled into it, fully clothed, and pulled a blanket up to his chin. I got into my own bed, the mattress suddenly feeling like a vast, empty continent. The space between my bed and the floor felt both infinitesimally small and miles wide. I turned off the light, plunging the room into a darkness punctuated only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the snow-caked window. Leo. His voice came out of the darkness, quiet and close. Yeah, thanks. It's just a floor, Julian. No, he said, and there was a strange thickness in his voice. Not just for that. For everything. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. We lay there in the quiet, separated by 2 feet of vertical space. I could hear every breath he took, the rustle of the blankets as he shifted. The room was warmer, it was true, but the heat I felt had nothing to do with the radiator. It was radiating from the man on my floor, a gravitational pull that seemed to warp the very space around me. This was the new ritual, I realized. The couch had been the antechamber. This was the inner room, and I had no idea how I was going to survive it. The floor became the new couch. It wasn't every night, but on the nights when the cold was particularly biting, or when the particular brand of loneliness in his eyes was too deep to ignore, the question would surface. Mind if I crash on the floor again? It was always phrased as a question, a performance of politeness that we both understood was just a formality. The answer was always yes. My bedroom, once my most private sanctuary, was now a shared space. I learned the topography of his sleeping form in the dark, the rhythm of his breathing, the way he would sometimes sigh in his sleep, a sound of such profound weariness it made my own chest ache in sympathy. I started photographing the space. Not him, never him directly. That felt like a violation, a step too far. But I photographed the indentation his head left on the pillow on the floor. I photographed the rumpled pile of blankets in the morning light after he'd left for work. I photographed his coffee mug, left by the sink. I was trying to capture the ghost of his presence, the way he was altering the landscape of my life, the quiet, seismic shifts occurring beneath the surface of the everyday. My photographs from that period are all quiet, domestic, and filled with a sense of profound and aching tenderness. They are pictures of a haunting, but a welcome one. Then came the night the final boundary dissolved. It was weeks, maybe 2 months, into the floor sleeping arrangement. It was a normal Thursday. No blizzard, no dramatic event. Just the accumulated weight of all the nights that had come before. He was on his pallet on the floor, I was in my bed. We had been talking for a while in the darkness, our voices low and intimate in the quiet room. We talked about his work, about a frustrating project he was on. We talked about my photography, about a gallery that had shown some interest in my peer series. The conversation wound down, and we fell into a comfortable silence. I was on the edge of sleep when he spoke again, his voice so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. Leo? I murmured, my eyes closed. There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of him shifting on the floor. I can hear your heart beating, he said. My own heart stuttered, then began to pound, a frantic drum against my ribs. Of course he couldn't. He was on the floor. It was a metaphor. It had to be. It's a quiet building, I managed to say, my voice thick with sleep and sudden, sharp anxiety. Another silence. Then, my back is killing me. The sentence was dropped into the dark like a stone into a still pond. It was another pretext, another piece of beautiful, transparent logic. The couch was too cold. The floor was too hard. The progression was as inevitable as gravity. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I held my breath, waiting. The sound of rustling blankets was louder this time. I felt, more than saw him move. The mattress dipped beside me. The warmth of his body was a sudden, shocking reality next to mine. He lay on his back, on top of the covers, a rigid line of tension just inches away from me. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. The air in the room was electric, charged with years of unspoken words, of carefully suppressed feelings. It felt like standing on a cliff edge, the wind howling, the drop terrifying and immense. He was in my bed. After all the nights on the couch, all the nights on the floor, he was finally, impossibly, in my bed. Is this okay? He whispered, his voice strained. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the ceiling, a silhouette in the dim light. It was the question, the one that mattered. It wasn't about the floor or the cold or his back. It was about this, about the proximity, the warmth, the crossing of this final, most intimate threshold. My entire body was screaming. Part of me wanted to say no, to retreat to the safety of our old friendship, to the manageable ache of unrequited love. It was a familiar pain, a safe one. This new territory was terrifying, uncharted. But another part of me, the part that had been waiting patiently in the dark for years, knew that this was the hinge. This was the moment everything would turn. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I turned my head on my pillow to look at him. He was so close. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the pulse beating in his throat. "It's okay, Julian," I whispered back. He visibly relaxed, a long, slow sigh escaping his lips. He turned his head to face me. Our eyes met in the gloom. His were dark and deep and filled with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. We just looked at each other for a long time, the silence stretching, but it wasn't an empty silence anymore. It was full. It was the silence of two people standing on the brink of a revelation, a silence that held more truth than any words we had ever spoken. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes. It was a question, asked without a single word. My own eyes fluttered shut, a silent consent, a surrender. He moved slowly, tentatively, as if he were afraid I might bolt. I felt the whisper of his breath on my skin, then the soft, hesitant pressure of his lips against mine. It wasn't a passionate kiss. It wasn't demanding or hungry. It was a question. It was a confession. It was the softest landing after a long and terrifying fall. It tasted of salt and relief, of years of unspoken longing finally finding a home. It was quiet, and it was gentle, and it was everything. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against mine. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't answer. I just reached out and tangled my fingers in his, our hands resting on the small space on the mattress between us. His fingers curled around mine, holding on tight, as if he were afraid I might disappear. We lay like that for a long time, forehead to forehead, hand in hand, the storm outside having finally found its way inside, not as a destructive force, but as a quiet, cleansing rain. The ritual was over. Something new was beginning. And in the silent, warm darkness of my bedroom, for the first time in a very long time, I felt a profound and unwavering sense of peace. The morning after was a landscape of excruciating tenderness and blinding fear. I woke first, as I always did. The light filtering through the blinds was soft and gray, painting stripes across the room. Julian was still asleep, his head on the pillow next to mine, one arm thrown across my chest. His breathing was a slow, steady rhythm against my side. He looked peaceful, younger, all the tension and exhaustion of the past few months erased from his face in sleep. My heart swelled with a feeling so immense and terrifying I thought it might actually break. For a few perfect, suspended moments, I allowed myself to believe. I let myself feel the weight of his arm, the warmth of his body, the reality of him here, beside me, not on the floor, not on the couch, but here. I committed the image to memory, photographing it with my mind. The way a lock of his dark hair fell across his forehead, the slight parting of his lips, the steady rise and fall of his chest. Then he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, blinking against the morning light. He looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, his expression was soft, unguarded, a continuation of the night's intimacy. And then awareness dawned. The memory of what had happened, of the line we had crossed, flooded into his eyes, and it was like watching a shutter close. A wall went up, swift and silent, and utterly impenetrable. He pulled his arm back as if he'd been burned. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, his back to me. The space he vacated was instantly cold. I have that early meeting," he mumbled, his voice rough. He didn't look at me. He was already pulling on the clothes he'd discarded on the floor the night before. "Julian," I said, my voice quiet. My heart had begun a slow, painful descent into the pit of my stomach. "I gotta go," he said, his back still to me. He stood up, ran a hand through his messy hair, and walked out of the bedroom without a single backward glance. I heard the front door open and close, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden, deafening silence of the apartment. He was gone. The warmth, the intimacy, the whispered confession of the night before, it had all evaporated with the morning light, leaving behind a cold, damp chill and the lingering scent of his skin on my pillows. I lay there, staring at the empty space beside me, and a familiar, agonizing ache settled back into my chest. It was the old pain, the one I knew so well, but it was sharper this time, laced with the fresh poison of a hope that had been allowed to bloom for a few short hours before being ruthlessly cut down. I had been a convenience, a port in a storm, and now the storm had passed, and he had set sail, leaving me stranded on the shore. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The silence from Julian was absolute. My texts went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. The man who had, for months, made my apartment his second home had vanished completely. My space, once a sanctuary for him, now felt like a tomb. Every corner of it screamed his absence. The dent on the sofa cushion, the spot on the floor by my bed, the empty space next to me on the mattress, they were all monuments to my own foolishness. I tortured myself by replaying the kiss, the conversation, every moment of the past few months, searching for the sign I had missed, the clue that would explain this sudden, brutal withdrawal. Had I misread everything? Had it all been a product of my own wishful thinking, a narrative I had spun from loneliness and longing? The anger came after the hurt. It was a slow-burning fire. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for his inability to face what had happened between us. But mostly, I was angry at myself. I was angry for letting him in, for letting down the walls I had so carefully constructed. I had broken the cardinal rule. I had risked the friendship. And now, it seemed, I had lost everything. The quiet observer had finally stepped into the frame, and in doing so, had ruined the entire picture. The ambiguity we had lived in had been a fragile ecosystem, and the kiss had been the cataclysm that destroyed it. I couldn't go back to the way things were, to being the quiet, understanding friend who asked for nothing. That person was gone. The silence was no longer comfortable. It was a weapon he was using against me, and it was tearing me apart. After a week of this radio silence, something inside me snapped. I couldn't live in this limbo. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded most. I needed to hear him say it. I needed the finality of a rejection to cauterize the wound. I drove to his apartment. It was late, the same time he used to show up at my door. The symmetry was not lost on me. As I stood in the hallway outside his door, my heart pounded with a nauseating mixture of fear and resolve. This was it. I was about to set fire to the whole beautiful, painful history between us, just to see what, if anything, would be left in the ashes. I knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet hallway. I waited. For a long moment, there was nothing. I was about to turn away, to accept the silence as his final answer, when I heard the sound of the deadbolt turning. The door opened a few inches. He peered out, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. When he saw it was me, his expression shuddered. He tried to close the door. "Julian, don't," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I put my hand on the door, holding it open. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his voice flat. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Nothing to talk about," I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping me. "You kiss me, you sleep in my bed, and then you disappear for a week without a word, and you think there's nothing to talk about? You don't get to do that, Julian. You don't get to use me as your emotional fallout shelter and then board it up when you feel like it." He flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger or annoyance. It was fear, pure, unadulterated terror. "Let me in," I said, my voice softening. "Please." He hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped back, letting me into the apartment I hadn't seen in months. It was cold and sterile, boxes half-packed in one corner. It looked like a place no one lived in. He closed the door behind me, and we stood in the entryway, the air thick with tension. "What do you want me to say, Leo?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That I'm sorry? I am. I'm so sorry. I never should have. It was a mistake." The word mistake landed like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs. So that was it. The answer I had been dreading. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice hollow. "Was it a mistake all those nights you showed up at my door because you couldn't stand to be alone? Was it a mistake when you slept on my floor? Was it a mistake every single time you chose to be in my space instead of your own? Or was the only mistake the part where you finally touched me?" Tears pricked at my eyes, and I fought them back furiously. I would not cry in front of him. I don't know, he said, his voice cracking. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure distress. I don't know what any of it was. I was a mess, Leo. Chloe and my whole life felt like it was falling apart. And you were just there? You're solid. You're quiet, and you're solid, and being at your place was the only time I felt like I could breathe. So, I was a utility, I said, the bitterness coating my tongue. I was a piece of furniture. A human security blanket. No, he said, his voice rising with a sudden passion. He took a step toward me. No, it was never that. Don't you get it? That's what scares me. It wasn't just about you being there. It was about it being you. He stopped, his chest heaving, as if the confession had been ripped out of him. I've spent my whole life doing what I was supposed to do. I had the right major, the right job, the right girlfriend. I had a blueprint for my entire life, and I was following it perfectly. And then it all fell apart, and I was lost. And in the middle of all that, there was you. And nothing with you felt like it was part of a plan. It just felt right. It felt more real than anything else. He was looking at me now, his eyes pleading. That night, when I kissed you, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper again. That was the most honest I've been with myself in years. And it terrified me. Because it's not in the blueprint, Leo. You're not in the blueprint. And I have no idea what to do with a feeling that big when I don't have a map for it. The anger inside me dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just lost. He had spent his entire life on a clearly marked highway, and he had suddenly found himself in a dense, uncharted forest, and he was terrified. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself, from a truth so large and unexpected it threatened to shatter his entire identity. I closed the distance between us, standing just in front of him. So you're scared? I said softly. Okay, I get it. I'm scared too. I've been in love with you for half my life, Julian. Do you have any idea how terrifying that is? To stand here right now, telling you that. His eyes widened, a universe of shock and wonder and dawning understanding in them. Leo, he breathed, his voice full of a pain that mirrored my own. You think you don't have a map? I continued, my voice trembling but steady. Welcome to my world. There is no map for this. We're in the wilderness, Julian. Together. And you can either stay here, in this cold, empty apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of a life you were supposed to have, or you can be in the wilderness with me. But you have to choose. I can't live in the silence anymore. I can't go back to being your friend who pretends not to feel what I feel. I can't. I had laid all my cards on the table. My heart was exposed, beating frantically in the open air between us. The silence that followed was the most terrifying of my life. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly racing. I had given him the choice. I had drawn a line in the sand, and I had no idea which side he would land on. Then, slowly, tentatively, he reached out his hand. He didn't touch my face or my shoulder. He simply laid his palm flat against my chest, right over my heart. He could feel its frantic, terrified rhythm under his hand. He closed his eyes, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. I hate being alone, he whispered, the words that had started it all. I know, I whispered back. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with mine. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else now. A glimmer of resolve, a flicker of hope. I don't want to be, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Anymore. And with that, he leaned in and kissed me again. This kiss was different from the first. It wasn't tentative or questioning. It was a choice. It was a promise. It was the first step into the wilderness, taken together. It was messy and desperate and beautiful, and it felt like coming home. The aftermath of that confrontation was not a sudden, magical fix. There was no movie-perfect moment where all fear and confusion vanished. Instead, it was the beginning of a slow, deliberate process of learning a new language together. The first words of that language were spoken in the quiet of his sterile apartment. After that second, desperate kiss, we just held each other for a long time, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm we had just crossed. He didn't let go, as if he was afraid I might dematerialize. I didn't want him to. It felt like we were two solitary planets that had finally, against all odds, found a shared orbit. We started to talk, truly talk, not about the weather or work or movies, but about the fear. He talked about the suffocating pressure he'd felt his whole life to be a certain kind of man, to want a certain kind of life. He admitted that his relationship with Chloe, while rooted in genuine affection, had also been a performance, a comfortable role he knew how to play. He confessed that the loneliness he'd felt wasn't new. It was a chronic condition he had simply learned to mask with noise and people in motion. Being with me, in the quiet of my apartment, was the first time he'd ever let the mask drop, and the person underneath was someone he barely recognized. He was afraid of that person, of what he wanted, of what it meant for the carefully constructed identity he had built. I listened, and for the first time, I talked too. I told him about the years of quiet longing, about the secret garden of my affection for him. I told him how I had resigned myself to being the observer, the permanent fixture in the background of his life. I confessed my own terror, the fear that I had just been a port in his emotional storm, that his feelings were a temporary symptom of his heartbreak, not something real and directed at me. Laying these truths bare was terrifying. It was like exposing the most vulnerable parts of ourselves to the harsh light of day. But with each confession, a layer of fear was stripped away, replaced by a fragile, tentative layer of trust. We were mapping the wilderness, not with a pre-drawn chart, but by describing the landscape to each other, landmark by landmark. The new normal began to take shape, not in grand gestures, but in a series of small, intentional acts. A few days after our talk, he showed up at my door, but this time it wasn't at midnight. It was at 7 in the evening, and he was carrying a bag of groceries. "I figured we could make dinner," he said, a shy, hopeful smile on his face. Instead of ordering in. It was a simple act, but it was significant. It was a move from seeking refuge to actively building a shared life. We cooked together in my small kitchen, bumping elbows, learning the rhythm of moving around each other in a space designed for one. It was awkward and clumsy and perfect. We ate at my small dining table, a table that had mostly been used for sorting prints and holding mail. That night, it held 2 plates, 2 glasses, and a conversation that was easy and warm, free from the weight of unspoken things. He stayed the night, but this time, there was no pretext. There was no talk of cold floors or bad backs. When we were ready for bed, he simply took my hand and led me into the bedroom. He climbed into bed beside me, and when he wrapped his arm around me, it wasn't a hesitant, questioning gesture. It was a statement. It was a declaration of intent. We didn't do anything more than hold each other, but it was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. It was the intimacy of pure, unadulterated presence, of choosing to be in the same space, breathing the same air, without any need for justification or excuse. Slowly, his life began to merge with mine. The half-packed boxes in his apartment were eventually unpacked, but many of their contents found their way to my place. A stack of his favorite books appeared on my nightstand. His ridiculously expensive coffee maker, which he swore was the only thing that made drinkable coffee, took up residence on my kitchen counter. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, began to feel like a home for 2. The changes were subtle, organic. One day I realized he had his own drawer in my dresser, filled with his t-shirts and socks. I had no memory of us deciding this. It had just happened, a natural consequence of him being there more often than he was not. The door to my bedroom, which I used to close so carefully to create a barrier between us, was now left open. It was no longer a boundary to be respected or a threshold to be tentatively crossed. It was simply a passageway between 2 parts of our shared home. The couch was still used for watching movies, but now we were curled up together under the quilt, his head on my chest, my arm around his shoulders. The physical closeness that had once been so fraught with anxiety and meaning had become our default state, as natural and necessary as breathing. It was a quiet, domestic intimacy, built not on grand romance, but on the steady accumulation of small, everyday moments. My photography changed, too. I finally started taking pictures of him. Not just the ghosts of his presence, but him. I took a picture of him one morning, asleep in our bed, the morning light soft on his face. It was the picture I had been too afraid to take before, the one I had only captured in my memory. When I showed it to him, he didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a long time, then looked at me, his eyes full of a soft, wondering emotion. He was finally seeing himself the way I had always seen him. Beautiful, worthy of being seen, worthy of being loved. He started coming with me on my photo excursions, not as a subject, but as a partner. He would carry my bag, or just stand with me in silence as I waited for the light to be just right. He learned to see the world a little bit more like I did, and I learned to exist in the world a little bit more like he did, less in my head, more in the moment. There were still moments of fear, flashes of the old anxieties. Sometimes I would catch a look on his face, a flicker of the old confusion, and my heart would seize with the fear that this was all temporary, that he would wake up one day and realize he'd made a huge mistake. And sometimes he would confess to feeling that same fear, the fear that he wasn't cut out for this, that he would eventually disappoint me or revert to his old ways. But now, instead of letting that fear create a silent chasm between us, we talked about it. We learned to be a safe harbor for each other's anxieties. We learned that love wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to walk through it together. One evening, months after that first rainy night, we were lying in bed, reading in comfortable silence. A storm was raging outside, the rain lashing against the window, the wind howling. It was a mirror of that first night, but everything was different. The storm was outside, not in. I looked over at him, engrossed in his book, his face calm and content in the warm glow of the bedside lamp. He was home. We were home. He must have felt my gaze, because he looked up from his book and smiled at me. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "I was just thinking about that first night you showed up here, in the rain." His expression softened. He put his book down and shifted closer to me, tracing a line along my jaw with his finger. "I was so lost," he said quietly, "and so scared." "I know," I said. "So was I." "I'm not scared anymore," he said, his eyes searching mine. "Not with you." He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, gentle kiss that spoke of comfort and certainty and a deep, quiet joy. It was a kiss that held the memory of all our shared moments. The silent companionship, the hesitant touches, the whispered confessions, the shared fears, the quiet mornings. It was the culmination of a language we had built from scratch, a language of patience and presence and profound, unwavering care. The hinge had turned, the door had been opened, and on the other side was not a terrifying wilderness, but a quiet, beautiful landscape we could finally, truly call our own. We had found our way not by following a map, but by holding on to each other in the dark. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we had found everything we never knew we were searching for.